Hey buddy, welcome back to another video. Today we're taking a deep dive into gaming mice settings and features, an aspect of mice I thought was pretty straightforward, but as it turns out there is a ludicrous amount of misinformation when it comes to this aspect of gaming peripherals. And seeing as I've used, reviewed, and disassembled over 100 plus gaming mice, I wanted to make a full, in-depth, factual guide going over mouse settings and features and explaining how said features function and what pros and cons each have, and talk in depth about what settings you should or shouldn't use on your gaming mouse. But before we get into the video, if you enjoy this guide and find it helpful, be sure to leave a like and get subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any future guides, reviews, or teardowns. And be sure to share this video with a friend so they know what settings to use on their mice so they stop tossing your ranked games. But without further ado, let's get right into today's video. Alright, now before we talk about your mouse's settings specifically, there's a couple Windows related settings we'll need to tweak first. Firstly, you'll want to disable Enhanced Pointer Precision, as this adds an acceleration curve to your input, meaning that slow motions will be consistent in their speed, but if you move your mouse quickly for a flick, it'll add acceleration to it, causing you to overshoot your target. So make sure to disable this feature by going to your control panel, click Change Mouse Settings, and in the Pointers option tab below Motion, there'll be a small button for the Enhanced Pointer Precision, so make sure this is disabled, and make sure it stays disabled as it has a habit of turning itself back on after Windows updates, so whenever Windows does a big update, be sure to recheck this to make sure it hasn't been re-enabled. Secondly, there is also a setting for your cursor's speed. Now most of the time this doesn't impact the speed of your mouse in games, however some games use the Windows cursor speed for menu navigation, meaning if a setting is set to lower values, navigation in menus can be rather tedious. As such, the general rule of thumb is to set the cursor speed to 6 in the legacy settings or 11 in the modern settings tab, but you can edit this setting as needed without impacting gameplay in most cases. Another very important feature to change is the USB power settings, which you can do by opening Device Manager, and at the top bar, click View Devices by Connection, then scroll down until you find your root USB hub or bus driver, right click on it, click Properties, and then go to the Power Management tab. Once there, make sure the option to allow Windows to disable this device to save power is disabled, and disabling this ensures your USB devices will always run and won't be automatically disabled by Windows. I would also recommend altering your Windows USB power settings as well, which you can do by going to your power plan settings, then go to the advanced power plan settings option here, scroll down to the USB settings tab, and disable USB selective suspending. And on the topic of USB ports, as a rule of thumb, you always want to plug peripherals such as mice and keyboards into your PC's rear I/O, specifically into USB 3.2 red or USB 3.0 blue ports. You can also utilize high-speed USB-C ports if your mouse includes a C-to-C cable, but seeing as 99% of peripheral cables are still A-to-C types, ensure you plug them into the aforementioned ports. The same rule applies for laptops too, although make sure not to plug any peripherals into any USB-A or C charging ports. And if you didn't already know, you should always position a mouse's wireless dongle as close to your mouse as possible. Generally speaking, I recommend positioning it against the top edge of your mouse pad, as that ensures there is a clear line of sight between the mouse and the dongle, and it also allows for the shortest transmission range. Moving on to dots per inch DPI, which is also known as counts per inch CPI, this setting determines how many dots or count, the technical unit of movement measured by the sensor, are processed and sent to your PC for every inch of physical movement. Now DPI specifically is an aspect of mice that has a lot of misconceptions around it, specifically when it comes to modern sensors and hardware, as brands advertise their mice with a focus on their respective DPI values. Because of this, many users have been led to believe that higher values are indicative of superior performance, but in reality a mouse's DPI is not indicative of a mouse's overall performance at all, as this is determined by several other factors, namely hardware like the mouse's MCU and sensor, and also its firmware. And on every mouse on the market, despite how they're advertised, you can only utilize a very small range of their respective DPI and CPI values, as going over certain values can cause tracking inaccuracies depending on the mouse's hardware. This said cutoff with mice with 3395 or 3950 series sensors is 3200 DPI, as going above this value can introduce something called jitter, which is caused by noise in the sensor's frame data that causes randomized erratic movements even if you're not moving your mouse. Now obviously this jitter can significantly impact performance, hence why it's generally recommended to use DPI values below or up to said cutoff. However, it's worth noting that on some high-end sensors such as the 3955 and 3970 series sensors, this cutoff is raised to 60 6400, but even on said sensors, going above this value still introduces jitter, but seeing as the 3970 series sensors are exclusive to a certain brand and the 3955 is just coming to market as of recording this video, on the majority of mice you'll find on the market currently, their recommended DPI cutoff is 3200. Another factor to consider when setting your mouse's DPI is polling rate saturation, as there is a dependency between a mouse's polling rate and its DPI level. This dependency is due to the data required to saturate a mouse's report rate, as they require more data than standard report rates do. As such, lower DPI values such as 4 and 800, the previous standard, while they can fully saturate 1 kHz report rates without issue, they can't provide enough data to fully saturate higher report rates. This is why 1600 and 3200 DPI have become the new standard, as 1600 DPI adequately saturates 1 to 4 kHz report rates, while 3200 DPI is best suited for 8000 Hz, as that report rate is highly data reliant, hence the need for a higher DPI level to fully saturate it. This is why the advertised DPI for mice just frankly doesn't matter, as on every mouse on the market, regardless of how it's marketed, you'll only be using a tiny segment of its advertised DPI, and as of right now, 1600 DPI is generally considered the sweet spot for most mice and report rates, but as mentioned, if you want to use 8000 Hz polling, 3200 DPI is recommended, but again, I would avoid going over 3200 DPI on 3395 and 3950 series sensors, and 6400 DPI on 3955 and 3970 series sensors, as doing so can introduce the aforementioned jitter issues. Moving on to polling rates, you can simply think of this aspect of mice as the number of times the mouse sends data to your PC. For example, on 1000 Hz polling, your mouse is reporting input data to the PC 1000 times per second, but on higher report rates, since you're doubling, quadrupling, or octupling the amount of polls, this improves the mouse's performance by quite a bit, as with more polls, the mouse is updating its location more frequently, which in turn improves the mouse's responsiveness and makes in-game movements more akin to your natural ones. High polling rates also have the benefit of reducing latency, as more frequent polls reduces the delays between said polls on lower report rates, allowing for latency reductions. Now for specifics with this, on 125 Hz there's around 8 milliseconds of latency on average, on 500 Hz there's around 2 milliseconds of latency on average, on 1000 Hz there's around 1 millisecond of latency on average, on 2000 Hz this is cut down to 0.5 milliseconds on average, on 4K Hz polling this is further cut down to 0.25 milliseconds average, and on 8000 Hz polling you have the lowest latency average of 0.125 milliseconds. However, the downsides of high report rates is that they require additional CPU processing to function, as your PC has to process more polls, which can cause compatibility issues on older hardware or in some game engines, which most commonly take the form of frame rate issues. High polling rates also come at the cost of increased power draw, as the additional processing required by the mouse's hardware to saturate said report rates can impact the mouse's overall runtimes by varying degrees. However, the impacts of high polling rates are most notable on 8K Hz, whereas on 4K and 2K Hz, said impacts are more subtle. But regardless, if you choose to utilize a high report rate on your mouse, you will need to recharge it more frequently than you'd have to if you were using a 1K Hz report rate. But even though there are some downsides quote-unquote to high polling rates on older hardware, considering their benefits specifically in regards to their latency and performance improvements, I'd highly recommend using the maximum polling rate your PC supports. Generally speaking, this will be 2 or 4K Hz on most systems, but test each polling rate on your PC to see what the maximum report rate your hardware can support, and use that going forward. And as a last polling related note, the benefits of said report rates are more noticeable on higher refresh rate monitors, specifically 240 Hz and above. On 60 to 144 Hz, said benefits are less noticeable, but regardless of your monitor's refresh rate, the latency benefits of high polling rates still apply, hence why I still recommend using them even if you have a lower refresh rate monitor. Moving on to Debounce, this feature acts, as per its naming, as a filter for the main click switches, which helps to prevent double clicking or slam clicking issues. Generally speaking, this filter ranges from 0 to 20 milliseconds and is usually preset to 4 or 8 milliseconds on most mice. This means that on many mice in their default configuration, said filter adds varying degrees of latency out of the box depending on the Debounce algorithm used by the mouse, which can vary from brand to brand. As such, I'd highly recommend adjusting a this filter to 0 or 2 milliseconds to remove any added latency, but if doing so causes double clicking or slam clicking issues, you'll have to manually calibrate this filter to prevent said issues, especially over long-term use as switches are worn in. But it's worth noting that adjustable debounce is a feature you won't see on every mouse on the market, which is disappointing, but as a fun fact, even if a mouse doesn't show a debounce filter in their software, that doesn't mean the mouse doesn't have one, as every single mouse on the market uses some form of debounce algorithm, regardless of the switch type the mouse uses, and this even goes for magnetic switches such as hits. But to be fair, said filter likely won't make or break a mouse's usage experience or performance per se, but having the ability to adjust said filter and reduce any added latency is a great feature to see on mice that support it, that is, and hopefully in the future we'll see more brands allow for adjustable debounce filters in their products, particularly the bigger name brands in the peripheral market, as none of them have this option as of recording this video. The next setting we have is liftoff distance, which is better known as LOD, which is the distance or height at which the sensor stops tracking on various surfaces. Now, as a note to this, there is a lot of variance with this feature from sensor to sensor, as the way a 3395's LOD functions is completely different from that of a Hero 2 or a 3950 or a higher end series sensor. But generally speaking, most mice that utilize 3950 or 3955 series sensors support 3 LOD levels, 0.7, 1, and 2 millimeters. However, there are modified versions of said sensors that support LOD ranges that allow for more precise tuning, where a 0.1 millimeter increment of a 0.7 to 1.7 millimeter LOD range can be utilized, but currently said ranges are quite rare, and the majority of mice on the market just use the traditional 0.7, 1, and 2 millimeter LOD levels. But regardless of the LOD type used by a mouse, on nearly every mouse, said LOD will be preset to 1 millimeter, as that is considered the universal level, so to speak, as it's compatible with essentially every skate and pad type. As such, and unlike many other features we've talked about so far, LOD is something I wouldn't recommend tweaking in most cases, as altering it can cause tracking issues, specifically if you use aftermarket skates. But that said, if you want to adjust the behavior of your mouse's LOD to fit your specific aim style, you can do so freely. Just be mindful of potential issues with aftermarket skates and hard pad types specifically, like glass pads, as they often have tracking issues on LODs lower than 1 millimeter. But as a general rule of thumb, if you're unsure of what level to use and just want universal compatibility with most skate and pad types, just use 1 millimeter or medium LOD levels for the best experience. Alright, next up let's talk about one of the most controversial features found on modern gaming mice, motion sync. Now, despite popular belief, this feature is actually very beneficial to performance, but to understand the benefits of this feature, we have to understand how mice function, as in a very basic layman's explanation, there are 3 core components to a mouse's functionality: the sensor's frames, the MCU's processing of said frames, and your PC's poll. Now, on every mouse, the sensor constantly takes frames at varying rates depending on the polling rate it's set to, and several other factors. These frames are then sent to the MCU, which processes the frame's data, and when the mouse is polled by the PC, the processed frame data is sent to the PC, which is then translated into inputs you see on your screen. However, none of the steps in this input process are aligned, meaning it's a rather disjointed process from a functional standpoint. But despite this, this has been the standard for years now, as there hasn't been any changes to this methodology until now. As with motion sync enabled, it synchronizes the MCU's frame processing to your PC's poll, removing one disjointed segment of the input process while the rest stays the same. This synchronization does come at the cost of slight additional latency though, due to the alteration to the MCU's processing, but said added latency is negligible as it's within a 0.125 to 0.5 millisecond range depending on the report rate used. And despite the added latency quote-unquote from this feature, keep in mind that the trade-off for this is significantly improved input consistency, as motion sync not only removes the potential micro stutters caused by the delay between the MCU's processing and the PC's poll, it also makes the mouse's input more natural and consistent as it's processing a frame when the PC polls and it's not waiting for it, which is well worth the minimal added latency in my opinion. Now, a common gripe users have with motion sync is that it changes how a mouse feels, and there is truth to this as it absolutely does, but this different altered feel that users complain about is due to motion sync making your inputs more consistent. But seeing as this is a new feature, and considering we've all been accustomed to the traditional disjointed input of mice that's been the standard until now, any change to that process will obviously be seen as a negative in the short term. But looking at the whole picture from a functional point of view, motion sync is very beneficial, especially when it's paired with higher report rates, as with more polls, more data is being sent to your PC, further improving its benefits. And while it does change the way your mouse feels slightly, after a few days of acclimation, you'll notice just how much more consistent and responsive motion sync makes your mouse feel, hence why I recommend using motion sync on most gaming mice. However, it's worth noting that motion sync doesn't offer any tangible benefits when combined with AAK polling due to the report rate, which is why many brands disable motion sync when 8K Hz polling is utilized. It's also worth noting that depending on your mouse's hardware, the feel of motion sync can vary a little bit, as on mice with 3395 sensors and no high polling rate support, motion sync can feel rather floaty, hence why this feature got such a bad reputation at first, as its initial implementation was pretty bad to be honest. But on mice with more modern hardware, such as ones that utilize 3950, 3955, or 3970 series sensors, the implementation of motion sync is astronomically better. So if you have a mouse that uses more modern hardware, I would highly recommend using motion sync in combination with 2K or 4K polling for the best usage experience and performance. Just be sure to give yourself a couple days to get used to the altered input feel. Whereas if you have an older mouse that utilizes a 3395 or older generation sensor, I'd avoid using motion sync in this case. If the mouse supports high polling rates, it might be a little more palatable, but I'd still avoid it due to the hardware limitations with older generation sensors. Now, on the vast majority of mice on the market, pretty much every single brand allows you to toggle motion sync yourself. However, some brands, but most notably RAZER, have motion sync baked into their sensors, quote unquote, meaning they cannot be toggled on and off by the user, which can be an issue for some people who don't like the feeling of motion sync, but given the benefits of motion sync, it's understandable why they've done this. And as a last latency related note here, I'm sure there'll be people complaining in the comments section about how the added latency from motion sync ruins the feel of their mice, but considering said added latency is humanly imperceivable, it's a non-issue given the benefits of motion sync in my opinion. Next up we have angle snapping, which is a feature I'm frankly shocked is still even offered on gaming mice, as its functionality is extremely detrimental to performance. This is because this feature, as per its name, snaps movements to the closest vertical or horizontal axis of an invisible grid across your screen, allowing for even X and Y axis movements without the need to aim accurately on them. However, obviously, this can cause severe inconsistency when aiming, as while it can improve accuracy on the X and Y axis, if you're aiming for a target on a diagonal axis, angle snapping will auto-correct the movement to the closest X or Y axis, severely impacting accuracy and performance. Angle snapping also adds latency around 1 millisecond in most cases, as the mouse's MCU has to constantly monitor and correct movements. As such, if you're using your mouse for gaming, you should never use angle snapping under any circumstances, as it's extremely detrimental to performance. Technically speaking though, there are some use cases where it can be slightly beneficial, such as in productivity or design tasks, but even in those cases it's still not exactly something I'd recommend using. But if you like the concept of angle snapping but don't want to deal with the downsides of it, utilizing sensor tilting is a great way to improve aiming consistency on all axes, not just X and Y, and it also has the benefit of improving ergonomics, but we'll talk more about this particular feature in a few minutes. Moving on to Ripple, which is also called ripple control on some mice, this is a rather niche feature that's not used very often given its functionality. This feature acts as a stabilizer or smoother of sorts when using DPI values above a sensor's cutoff, as it helps to mitigate jitter. The function of this feature is similar in theory to angle snapping, as it filters and corrects movements, but just like angle snapping, this feature can be a negative, as not only does it rely on high DPI to be functional, which in itself has several downsides. It can also filter out intentional movements impacting performance, particularly when doing small microcorrections. Ripple also adds around 1 to 3 milliseconds of latency when enabled, as the filtering required to reduce the jitter relies on additional processing from the mouse's MCU, and due to this, said processing can cause inputs to have a floaty, delayed feeling to them if it's enabled, which further impacts the mouse's performance. As such, Ripple is yet another feature I'd avoid using, even if you use higher DPI values, as the cons of both high DPI and Ripple itself far outweigh their positives. And if you want to use extremely low centimeter per 360 or sensitivity values, you'll be much better off using up to the DPI cutoff of your mouse's sensor and low in-game sensitivities, as doing so won't introduce jitter, thus eliminating the need for Ripple entirely. Moving on to sensor tilting, or sensor angling as it's sometimes called, this feature is one of the best and most beneficial features added to mice in the past couple of years, as it not only can significantly improve input consistency and performance, but also the user's ergonomics. This feature, while not necessarily being a new concept, has become a standardized feature on more modern sensors, such as the Pixar 3950 and subsequent series sensors. But unfortunately, older gen sensors, and notably the Logitech Hero 2 and its other variants, surprisingly, still don't support this feature, but thankfully there's a workaround to apply a sensor tilt to these mice despite them not supporting it officially, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. This feature, as it's named, allows you to angle your mouse's sensor which you can align with the angle of your grip style, synchronizing the angle of movement and allowing for more natural aiming, as well as improved consistency on all axes as mentioned earlier, and improved ergonomics. Now, the range at which you can tilt the mouse's sensor varies from mouse to mouse. Generally speaking, there's an 88-degree range total, but some mice offer even higher ranges. But regardless, seeing as the highest tilt I've ever seen was -20, any mouse that supports sensor tilting will allow for proper calibration. But uniquely, since the tilting is done on the mouse itself, as it just alters the way the MCU reads the sensor's frame data, there's no additional processing required to implement a sensor tilt, meaning it doesn't add any additional latency, unlike many of the other features we've covered in this video. Now, sensor tilting as a concept has a lot of nuance to it, far too much for me to talk about in today's video, but I will say I've been using this feature for almost a year now, and it has had an incredible impact on not only my aim but also my ergonomics, and I would highly recommend trying this feature out as it genuinely makes a massive difference. And as I mentioned earlier, you can even apply a sensor tilt to a mouse that doesn't support it locally with raw Excel, meaning you can use sensor tilting on older mice and Logitech mice. And if you want to learn more about sensor tilting, more about its benefits, or how to calibrate your grip style to a sensor tilt and how to apply it to your mouse, check out my ultimate guide to sensor tilting video, which goes in depth of how to use sensor tilting, its benefits, the ergonomics, and all the nuances all about it. And this video will be linked on screen here and down in the video description, as well as at the end of this video. So if you want to learn more about sensor tilting, be sure to check out that video after you watch this one. Next up, we have a feature that's been recently reintroduced to the peripheral market called Turbo Mode, which is also referred to as 20K FPS Mode and confusingly Comp Mode by some brands. Now, enabling this feature alters the behavior of a mouse's sensor's frame rate, forcing it to run at its maximum FPS instead of the dynamic FPS it normally utilizes. On 3950 series sensor, the maximum sensor frame rate is around 20,000 FPS, but on other sensor types such as the 3955 or 3970 series sensors, this feature operates the same way, just with a higher FPS cap. Now, the way this feature is advertised is similar to that of DPI, where the concept of bigger number is better is utilized again, alluding to the higher sensor FPS being better than lower ones, but as you might have already guessed, this is not the case by any means, just as I saw when it came to a mouse's DPI. As in reality, this mode doesn't actually improve performance, as forcing the sensor to take 20K frames every second significantly increases power draw, impacting a mouse's runtimes, and regardless of the amount of frames taken, a mouse's MCU still processes the same amount of frames depending on the report rate used, regardless of this mode being enabled or disabled. Now, technically speaking, since there's a larger sample size of frames for the MCU to pull from, the argument can be made that turbo mode makes inputs more accurate, but there's no real evidence to prove any tangible benefits from this feature, especially seeing as 2, 4, for an 8K polling already increases the sensor's frame rate, and even if there was an improvement, it would be extremely minimal, borderline negligible when compared to the benefits of high report rates and motion sync. But one potential use for this feature is that it has been shown to reduce jitter at higher DPI values, making it an alternative to ripple, so to speak, but again, high DPI has a myriad of downsides, further nullifying this feature. As such, turbo modes are largely a marketing gimmick, as it doesn't provide any beneficial performance compared to high polling rates, especially considering, as I just mentioned, high report rates already increase the sensor's frame rate to ensure there's enough data to fully saturate higher report rates, while having the benefit of utilizing more polls and decreasing latency. The power draw of this feature is also another confusing aspect, as it's similar to that of 4K polling on most mice, meaning that there's no real reason to utilize turbo modes over 2 or 4K polling and motion sync given its aforementioned benefits. As such, I would disable this feature, as utilizing 2 or 4K polling in combination with motion sync offers superior and actual performance benefits compared to turbo modes, and even in the case where a mouse doesn't support a high report rate, turbo mode won't offer any real advantages here either, as any potential benefits will be nullified by the mouse's 1kHz report rate. So this feature is largely just a marketing gimmick, and funnily enough, the concept of a turbo mode isn't actually new, as it's actually several years old, but even back then, people realized that the performance benefits from these modes were slim to none, hence why it hasn't been utilized for a very long time. But since a peripheral brand recently decided to re-enable this feature on their products, other brands have followed suit so they don't get left behind from a marketing perspective, even though this mode is essentially useless compared to high polling rates. And for power settings, this aspect of mice is pretty straightforward, as to get the maximum performance out of your mouse, you want to disable any form of power saving. Now, some mice even offer different performance modes, LP for low power and HP for high power, and for gaming use you should always be using HP modes. For sleep timers, this is up to personal preference. I normally disable them on my mice, but you can set them to your desired level. Just make sure not to set it too low where your mouse could go to sleep when you're stationary in a game holding an angle, for example. And for lighting, technically speaking, fancier lighting effects can, in some very rare cases, require so much processing power from the mouse's MCU, it could theoretically impact performance, especially when using higher report rates, but this only applies to mice with a crazy amount of lighting, not general gaming mice that have 1 or 2 status LEDs inside them. As such, on most gaming mice, you can leave lighting enabled, as it won't impact performance, but if you want to be 100% sure there won't be any impact, you can disable it. I personally leave lighting on my mice, as I like the utility of the indicator LEDs for showing report rates or profiles, and I haven't noticed any performance issues on my end. But as a good rule of thumb when shopping for a gaming mouse, I would avoid those gamery mice that have a shit ton of RGB, as while they look cool, there's likely no secondary controller for said lighting, meaning it will likely rely on the MCU for the lighting effects, which means there can be some performance impacts. However, there is an exception to this general rule here, as using a wired mouse or plugging a wireless mouse in usually removes any power saving modes applied to the mouse and will force a high performance profile when applicable. So if you have a wired mouse, don't worry about these power settings so much as they don't really apply here, but lighting still can be an issue in some cases, so keep that in mind. Alright, and lastly I wanted to quickly talk about some mouse-specific settings offered by various brands. Firstly, many mice offer a comp or high-speed modes on their mice, namely VAXI. Now this setting is different from the 20K FPS modes we talked about earlier, even though they share the same name in some cases, which is rather frustrating. Now these modes often act as performance profiles similar to the power modes we just talked about, ensuring the mouse's hardware runs at its maximum power, improving speed, connectivity, strength, etc. But we don't often see these modes anymore, but if your mouse does offer a high speed mode, enable it for the best performance. Next we have Frame Sync, a feature that debuted on the RAZER Viper V4 Pro, but will likely be coming to more mice in the coming year. This feature operates similarly to Motion Sync, but instead of just synchronizing the MCU's frame processing to a PC poll, this setting synchronizes the sensor's frame and the MCU's processing to the PC's poll, which significantly improves performance and drastically reduces power draw. This feature is genuinely one of the greatest advancements we've seen in the peripheral scene in a while, and it's what gives the V4 Pro its stellar performance and runtimes. And if you want to learn more about FrameSync and the more technical aspects of it, check out my review of the RAZER Viper V4 Pro, which will be linked on screen here in the video description and at the end of this video. Moving on to Gaming Surface Mode, which is featured on all of Logitech's products. This mode acts as an auto calibration for the Heroes 2 sensor, allowing the sensor to track on various surface types. This feature is very similar to the dynamic surface calibration that's baked into PixArt sensors, but it performs worse from my experience, as this mode can cause a lot of tracking issues with Logitech's mice, specifically on hard pad types, and as such, if you use a glass pad or any other kind of hard pad type, I would disable this feature, but if you're using a traditional soft pad type, you can leave it on, but if you experience any tracking issues or the signature Logitech sensor spin, disable this feature and manually calibrate the LOD for the best experience. And keeping in theme with Logitech's mice, I also wanted to talk about configuring the Logitech Super Strikes hit system. Now, from a performance point of view, to get the absolute maximum amount of hits, setting the actuation point to its lowest setting is the best, quote unquote. However, from my experience, the lowest actuation point was far too easy to misactuate during use, which impacted the mouse's overall usage. And seeing as the supposed benefits of hits vary significantly from person to person, I would recommend just using whatever actuation point and haptic feedback feels the best for you. If you want to use the rapid trigger setting, you can as well. I personally didn't really notice any benefit from it during my testing, so I disabled it, but as always, play around with hits configuration and see what settings feel the best for you. And lastly, if you have a mouse that utilizes single pole double throw, or better known as SPDT switches, well, as of recording this video, these switches are rather niche. They are likely going to become more popular in the near future, and we'll likely see more mainstream brands utilize them, and in order to get the most out of these switches, you have to configure them to their speed mode in the mouse's software, as doing so alters how these switches function, as they use a top contact instead of the bottom one for inputs, which allows these switches to have significantly lower latency than traditional switch types. So if your mouse utilizes these SPDT switches, be sure to enable their speed mode to get the most out of these switches. Alright, and with that, that's everything you need to know about mouse settings and their various features, and now you can tweak and tune your mouse's settings to get the maximum out of your mouse. I hope you found the video helpful, and if you happen to have any questions about any of the topics in this video or any other peripheral related inquiries, feel free to leave a question down below in the comments and I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have. And if you did find the video helpful, leave a like and get subscribed to the channel and share the video with a friend. And if you want to support my work here on the channel making these in-depth guide videos like this one, or the in-depth peripheral views of the repair guides via the Teardown project, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support my efforts here, and being a member gives you exclusive early access to upcoming videos, such as the video you just watched. But that's everything for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace.